Brigadier General Peter Zwack, U.S. Army retired. Brief introduction. General Zwack was the DAT, if that means anything to you, or Defense Attache in Moscow from 2012 to 2014. So think about those years and the things that might have occurred in that interesting time period. Think Crimea, think Ukraine, so some interesting historical developments. General Zwack has 34 years as a military intelligence and Eurasian Foreign Area Officer, a FAO. In the U.S. Army, he's served in West Germany. West Germany, you're giving away some bio data there. South Korea, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Russia. He's commanded company, battalion, and brigade levels and was Army Intelligence Chief in Europe for 2006 and 8 and in Afghanistan in 2008 and 2009. He is the recipient of the Distinguished Service Medal, the Bronze Star, the Legion of Merit, Defense Superior Service Medal, and many other awards. It's going to bury down here, but for me and others who are familiar with the military, he also wore a Ranger tab and airborne wings, so that's a big deal.
Those days I really didn't have hair.
He is now the Senior Russia-Eurasia Fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at National Defense University, and an adjunct fellow at the Pell Center at Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island. Not bad digs. I'd like to just mention that he, like many of the FAOs in the U.S. Army, kind of underappreciated service, he speaks Russian, German, Italian, and French. So welcome, General Zwack.
Yeah, that's very kind of you. Thank you so much. And let me shake your
I
hand.
don't think you need this, right? I'll take that.
Okay. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is real an honor to be here in front of you today. I'm a little bit in awe of you all, okay, for what you are, what you represent, what your history is, and the collective cranial brain power in here. I imagine it's just enormous. So I'll do everything I can to keep up. I'm going to bury you in the next 40 minutes in a sort of an immersion on a sort of a geostrategic look at Russia from now and with a look out toward the next generation. And we're going to try to take a walk around their geostrategic periphery. We're also going to look at some of the internals now and start with that. It will be very fast. We have a lot of ground to cover. How many of you have been in Russia or the Soviet Union? Okay, all right, because it's always good for me as an old intelligence officer to kind of get the lie of the country. But all of you obviously have studied aspects of Eurasia and all of that. So I think then what I'm going to do is just I'm going to get into this fast because we have a lot to go through in the next 40 minutes. I will say this, I'm focused, ladies and gentlemen, on perceptions and insights more than hard data statistics. I'll do a little bit of that. But it's what is going on out there in the world today? What drives the Russians to certain actions and behaviors? And I don't profess to understand. I try to because I don't live in Russian skin. And I always get wary about people that say I understand and they're not actually of that people or nation. So without further ado, we're going to get into it, and then we'll have a little bit of Q&A on the other side. Okay, so strap yourselves in, and let's go. All right, we're going to talk about politics for about 60 seconds. I don't want to go there today, okay? 2014, reset. It's already struggling, if you will, from 08-09 up until 2013, 2014. I mean, you have Magnitsky, you have all these other things going on. You have these big protests in Moscow. And so the Russian regime is anxious and also quite revisionist in his thinking. We get to 2014, the Ukrainian president flees. You all know the story, and the Russians invade Ukraine and illegally annex Crimea, and that really puts us on a different track. 2016, it's the political side. And I will only say, I think that the Russians at that time, they hacked, and I tell the Russians that. I don't think they anticipated the reaction that they got from us. I think it almost was very effective as a disinformation operation. And certainly, if you want to sow disruption and all that, it was. But it was so affected, I think the unintended consequences, and they never expected it to be as painfully for us successful, is both the American left and the American right ended up furious at the Russians. And we are in variations of that, but they have absolutely paralyzed our body politic, and they turned ourselves in on each other, and we're still suffering from the residuals. That's the entree. All right, we don't know where this is headed. I will only say this, and when you talk with senior, consequential, major nations, especially when dealing with autocrats, goodness doesn't come from the bottom. Has to be set from the top. The presidents, whether you like our president or not, need to have a relationship. If not, we're going to remain in this dangerous course that we're in right now. And we don't know where this is going to head. Now, Vladimir Putin, just very, very quickly, reelected earlier this year for another 6 years, 2024. Ladies and gentlemen, how about 18 years in power? 18 years in power. 12 as president and around as the prime minister. All right, he's going to be here unless there's a health issue or something like that. Question for everybody to be thinking of, on its present course, is time in Russia's favor? Or are they racing against time? And we'll get into that. How do you define Putin? I call him a high-level autocrat, low-level dictator. He's not Stalin. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in the country that would have never happened in the more, if you will, totalitarian Soviet regimes. But it is at the same time a controlling society and a lot of problems, and it is also one where there is an organic ruthlessness that we frankly have a hard time getting our head. But he also, I would submit, is seen as a somewhat of a senior, almost father figure, and that's developed over time. As one driver said in Rostov, I was talking, and somehow we got onto our president, which allowed me to ask them about their president. And well, tell me, what do you think of your president? And basically, on zabotytsa z nami. He takes care of us. And you know what? That was a profound statement in its simplicity. He takes care of us in almost some type of supra-individual. And there's a lot they don't like in the country. But so you've got a combination of autocrat, dictator, mafia, crime boss, and czar. I already talked about it. They did, and we're still dealing with that today. But this is not new. The intent is not new. The technological backbone is new. The fact that it used to be a whispering campaign that would take weeks or months to develop now can go in cyber fast, and it makes everything just faster. You're now in this insane 24/7 news cycle, and you can exploit with disinformation to the point where now our own side, or whatever side, is now pushing back on false narrative. And if it's out there for a few hours, for a lot of people, it becomes truth. We don't know where we're headed. Scientists, cyber. I mean, this is only, in my mind, a slight exaggeration. What is the next Pearl Harbor? All right, now getting into the Russian piece, the sanctions. Again, so sorry. I'm so sorry. The where is Russia going here with these actions, these egregious behaviors? But what drives them? We're not going to go to war over Ukraine, but you got to get their attention. Well, they are in part a kleptocracy, in my mind. It would be a pseudo-democratic, autocratic kleptocracy. Money matters. It hurts if money, especially if you are you've got a lot of illicit funds. It's an oligarchy in many ways. So the sanctions have really, really been painful. It's gotten their attention, but they are less effective now than they were from 14 to 16. And they have taken some pride in now this overused word. They're talking about their own resilience and how they're working around the sanctions now. And that we just don't have time to get into it. Very tight Krisha, a wing, a circle of Russians that are close to Putin, whether they're old KGB, FSB guys, oligarchs, moneyed interests. It's very, very tight. More like, in my mind, a mafia crime family than any boardroom or leadership group. But they can turn decisions around in days where it would take us weeks or months, or maybe even hours. All right, what happened in 2014? Again, oil matters, natural gas matters. They get sanctioned. They get sanctioned heavily. A lot of other things. And the economy goes into free fall. Oil prices collapse. The ruble, I was there in Moscow in 14 when I left. It was about 35 to the dollar. And as of half year later, it was 80. So if you're out there in the countryside, you've seen, and you're not well paid already, and life is already tough, you've just seen 60% of your personal net worth gone. And that created some challenges and continues out in the countryside. It has sort of marched back halfway, more than halfway as of this month. But this is a major issue. It's held them back. And their oil prices, got as high as 82, 85 recently. But when I was there, it was 116. Now look, it got down to 39, and we are driving military modernization. When you're trying to upgrade your nuclear arsenal and doing a whole lot of other things, this really hurt. And they use oil and natural gas as a coercive tool in their sort of asymmetry. Just in Europe alone, the round figure's about 30% of Europe gets their oil and natural gas, and a lot of politics linked to it. But important. Now, you all paid very attention. We're moving now into kind of what is driving, what's the source, if you will, of the Russian anger or resentment or pushback or revanchism or revisionism. There's a lot that goes on out there. But it kind of culminates a little bit right before the election. Putin gets up, and you would all be paying attention, on the 1st of March in their so-called State of the Union. And he starts talking about, the Sarmat, the latest SS-18 derivation, and nuclear cruise launch missiles, and all these new technologies. And then puts up a video of a MIRV weapon coming down in Florida. We all say it's probably Mar-a-Lago. But this was for a global audience. So, and that took a lot of people by surprise. Now, what's going on in the Russian periphery at the time? You've got Syria. They're in there. They've been successful, but it's been ugly. It's caught them a lot of negative flack. And really, in spring of 2017, 18, they get really called out on chemical weapons, and we go after them in the spring. We go after them last year as well. With airstrikes. They didn't anticipate that. That rocked the Russians the first time we did it, because the Syrians are their allies, and we militarily went in against their allies and wrapped their knuckles rather hard. And, oh, by the way, on top of that, the Israelis got a thing going on with the Iranians that it threatens to turn this from not just a civil war and a sectarian war to a regional war. And so while the Russians are sort of quarterbacking all this, it's also potentially a mess. And you saw what happened just a couple weeks ago. Syrians shot down a IL-20 Coot-A, and 15 Russians died. And of course, the question now is, what did the Israelis mask it based on, use the aircraft to mask it from the air defense? So it's all, bottom line is that the Russians have been paying a cost of late, though it has been more than not a successful operation for them. Other things in Russia, anti-corruption protests, they manage them pretty well. They moderate them. They are not in there with nightclubs like they used to. Billy clubs, nightclubs. And so they got that going on. And Navalny is the main guy. He will get out there. They'll go out and protest. And corruption, I believe, is the Achilles heel of this regime. But he gets arrested seemingly every other month. He's in for a month, and then they let him out. That's not Stalin behavior. And so they're managing it carefully. They got the pensioners furious at them recently. When they upped, these are hardworking people with, the life expectancy is 67, 68 years old. And then they've just moved the retirement age to 65. And so you got men and women in the street out there saying this is BS. St. Petersburg, they have a terrorist problem. They've managed it reasonably well this year. They will say we're in Syria, one reason to kill our terrorists in Syria, rather than here. Last year you had a metro attack from Kyrgyzstan, a young man, and killed nine citizens. And then the youth, who are generally supportive of Putin, they go in and they're trying to get control of an internet app that a lot of people use that crypt, and they were trying to basically put the heel on the Telegram, if you will, app, and a lot of people, thousands, went in the street. Youth will say, yeah, we're supportive of you, Vladimir Vladimirovich, but don't mess with their IT. You could read that in our own youth. Now, they seethe, the Russians. You got a lot going on out there. There's a lot of pushback. And so when they're out there on Olympic ice in February, remember their team has been banned. This is an other than Olympic Russia team that's out there that plays to different music and all that. They win the gold medal in the Olympics. And they're out there and they're playing a non-Russian national anthem in South Korea, and the Russian team breaks out and starts to sing their national anthem, and Russia goes nuts, and pride and all of that. And then, and so this matters. And then you just saw what the Russian soccer team did in the World Cup. They pulled off a very successful World Cup, not just internally, but according to a lot of the tourists that went up in there, and they didn't feel any police state type of activity. They really, really pulled it off. What else is going on right now? Because I want to lay the preamble as we continue our talk here. Major Russian-Chinese military exercise, Vostok East, you all read about it. Big inflated numbers and all that, but the bottom line is they're out there and 3,200 Chinese participate in this exercise for the first time near the Mongolian and Russian and Chinese border. And we don't know what this is. Is it cooperation? Is it training side by side, or are they actually working on interoperability tactics, techniques, and procedures? If so, then we really, really need to be mindful. So stay tuned. They do have trained before in the past, but mostly peacekeeping under the rubric of Shanghai cooperation. But this is the third time they met in the East Asia Forum just a few weeks ago, President Putin and Xi Jinping. All right, but what is going on? What is kind of this on the edge of? Just remember, Russia's Troika, I call it, of three major military operations or lines of operation that have occurred in the last 4.5 years, where the Russian military, still has a lot of challenges, has significantly improved. Whether it is little green men, low scale operations in Crimea, a hybrid, unattributed invasion with proxies, Russian troops in Eastern Ukraine, and then here in Syria, full-scale, low-level operations supported by full-scale strategic, and I don't use the word conventional anymore. I call it strategic non-nuclear. These are all non-nuclear, but they've used every, if you will, element of its non-nuclear toolkit in those 4 years, and have learned a lot. I find this an important, and they are also improved in their command and control, intelligence, surveillance, recon. Ladies and gentlemen, joint operations, inter-service, how about coalition operations? Okay, they got a lot to learn. They're not 10 feet tall. They see us as 10 feet tall, and that's important, but something to watch. Here's the key point here. Their chief of staff of the military, Gerasimov, last year, a great number of Russian officers have gained combat experience. And they're cycling them in fast. All right, number of you old Cold Warriors or remember it. I can't remember anything in the Cold War that potentially could have been as scary since whatever happened with Cuba. But we kill somewhere in the number of 200 Russian contractors in the middle of February or early February. I don't think, and everything I hear, we didn't know until it was going on that was a Russian-supported group of, if you will, proxies going up there, and a lot of the force were these guys from Wagner contractors. Over 200 people killed, those were out here, and that was consequential. The good news is that there are some tendrils of contact, not a lot between our militaries, but here the chairman started to finally, after 3 years of no chairman to Russian chief meeting, they met in Azerbaijan, Gerasimov and General Dunford, and then right 2 months later in Turkey, and then earlier this year in Helsinki. And I think part of all that got everybody to kind of take a deep breath and step back, because if ever there going to be an opportunity for the Russians to really go postal, it would have been this. And there are other independent ways that we have contact. I am a DoD civilian, and will go into Russia occasionally, non-mill to mill, but as an academic. And I do meet some of the old interlocutors that I worked with in years past. And this was just last year. The two former chiefs of staff of the military, head of their veterans now. He was the last Soviet, if you will, chief of staff. And this was the Russian General Makarov from 2008 to 2012, who really started a lot of the reforms. All right, we got to move fast here. You all know this, you've been working up, but we need to touch on it. Hybrid, new. This is not new, it's the techniques and the capabilities and the technological backbone is. Subversion, corrosion, all of that has happened in the past. Soviets were past masters of it. That's not new. All right, just a great Russian propaganda, religion, sport, war, terror, Ruski Mir, Russian peace. Okay, Russian world. All right, and there, as I said, there is a ruthless type of aspect of it that we in peacetime have a hard time dealing with. And you know, they're the Skripals and various assassinations and poisonings, and this continues. And this has gotten them into increasing trouble. It'll be interesting to see what the Russians say about what the Saudis have done in Turkey. However, they're also really good with the disinformation and creating doubt, non-attribution. Here are the little green men in February and March of 2014. And here's the choice before the referendum presented to the Russians, and you get it, I see it. Do you want a Crimea under fascist Ukraine? Or do you want a Crimea swathed in the white, blue, and red of Mother Russia? And so those were the choices. But I like this slide. We're working very, very hard in kind of getting our balance back in Europe. And this is where, this is the asymmetry. I believe asymmetry in the Russian mind, it's always about going after the other guy's strengths and countering it. But from the Russians, it's a little bit different because it starts from a sense of their own vulnerability. They feel vulnerable to us, so they are going to play everything they can, they believe, to even the odds. And you have this troubling phenomenon in the world, the autocrats ascendant. It used to be the 4+1 up until recently, these four in terror. Now in the latest defense documents, it's 2+3, meaning great powers, meaning Russia and China, and then the rest. And then you have this going on, which is a troubling tendency, especially in Europe and Turkey, where you have these countries that are beginning to show some troubling, if you will, right-wing intolerant aspects that kind of fly in the face of what we stand for, and also the European Union. But all of this, and what does all this type of stuff work on, is creates an atmosphere of pessimism. And that they have succeeded, I believe, in doubt. We're going to move even faster. Just all stuff that you know. We're going to talk geostrategic. I want to just refresh you on maps. You know this already. Many of you lived with this. 11 time zones. All right, from Lax to DC, Dulles, what, 3? Just to give you a sense of the size. Here's a size comparison. Okay, that doesn't have Alaska in it. It's still gigantic. It takes longer on the ground to go on the Trans-Siberian Railroad from Moscow to Vladivostok than it does from flying from New York to Honolulu, just to give you a sense of space. Permafrost, about 60% of the country is really it's hard to use, and a lot of it's melting, making their overground oil, gas pipelines particularly vulnerable. Arable, not particularly agrarian, but part of their resilience is they're building a lot of greenhouses and things like that. Russian railroad, this is so inhospitable in here, and so it's heavily the country centered in the west and to a lesser extent the south, and this is very underpopulated in the area around the Chinese border. The Ural Mountains, where Greater Asia meets Greater Europe, about 75 to 80% of the Russian population are here, and 20 to 25 out here. All right, so but a lot of the resources and all that are out in the west. Population density, again, just shows you how the population is concentrated to the west and a little bit to the south. Population growth, only slightly. They at least turned from a death rate to a growth rate in the last few years. But when you're dealing with a country of 145 million people, that's, they've got challenges. They're 40% of our population, 1/9 approximately of China's, and 1/3 of the European Union, unpacked in this gigantic country and heavily concentrated in the West. So demographically, they're out of balance and quite outnumbered. Death rate turned into a slight growth rate. It was a disaster in the 1990s. Just gives you a sense of all that Russia is dealing with. I'm trying to give you a sense that they are dealing with a lot. There's Russia, as far as in its size, by far the biggest country in the world, but very pedestrian in numerology. Only that Russia is as ethnically and religiously diverse as we are. And that's important because we kind of think of Great Russians, Caucasian Russian. There are a lot of things. Islam, about 8%, of, mostly secular, all right? But primarily of that, 90% plus Sunni, of the variety that they're killing in large numbers in Syria. Chechens and Dagestanis and militants and all that are generally Sunni. This is a ticking time bomb. And Russia lives in a world of existential threats, real, perceived, and contrived, I believe. Starts with the Mongols in the 1200s, where they come erupting out of Asia and slaughter Old Rus and drive the rest of the Russians into the north. And they've been fighting forever in the south as well. A lot of it brought on by their own imperial expansion. But nonetheless, I'm trying to create a sense of threat all around, and how do you get out? How do you preempt? Oh, by the way, when I argue with the Russians, the West is no threat, we get reminded about the Teutonic Knights, because they do think in historical terms, the Poles, the Swedes, Napoleon in 1812, and you think that's bad enough. Within the lifetime of the babushki, the grandmothers, the Nazis. And 20 to 26, between 20 and 26 million Soviets, most of them Russian, die, many of them civilian. And it doesn't make it right for when they tap this into the way they will portray the world, but it might give you an idea where they see threat, because that was not this was not just a war. This is a war of annihilation. And they almost lost it. All right, they win bloodily. We're in there, and everybody else. They regain the Soviet Union by the Balts get annexed again in 1940 with Nazis' help. And they have a buffer, and they have this point is global socialism. Remember this, how about 800 miles from East Germany border up to Leningrad at the time? All right, what happens if you're a proud Russian and all of a sudden, and the stroke right after Christmas 1991, your country, your empire, dissolves into 15 republics. You're the biggest one, but it dissolves. And over 25% of your citizens are now living outside of Russia. So I love this cartoon about suggesting Fukuyama the end of history. But that's really more akin to what the Soviet Union looked like in 1991. And many of these countries are the problem children of today. And their problem children, too, or the problem children that profess that need to stay under the Russian cloak. You've all read this in one thing, but in one way or the other, 2005, Putin, the Soviet Union, the collapse was a geopolitical disaster of the century. And then he talks about 10 millions of their co-citizens, compatriots. It's kind of a blueprint, what we've been seeing in the last 15, 20 years. No time to really get into it, but here's sort of the pockets, if you will, where of stress. And you hear about the Baltics. People get nervous about Belarus. You've got this conflict going on in Eastern, and there's Crimea. That's the next. That won't come back. And then Kazakhstan and others. But that's their periphery. We've already, again, Ukraine, they're in the Kurils, but that's a little bit different. Caucasus, the Balts again, and then Moldova, Transnistria, all frozen conflicts. NATO enlargement. I'm a NATO guy, so don't think that I'm in any way advocating a Russian position. I believe that NATO, first and foremost, was about bringing in the countries in between. If you read the book Bloodlands by Snyder, these are the countries that forever in history are being marched over, slaughtered. This is where the pogroms are going, the Holocaust. And we bring them into NATO. They finally have something credible. Oh, yeah, Russia, if you misbehave, that's also intended for you. But that was, but here, with all the enlargements, that border of 800 miles to Leningrad, there's Estonia, Narva. How about 80 miles? Now, if you're a Russian, you're viewing dimly the enlargement of NATO. But however, the countries that came in were worthy. I give you this as an example. I tell people don't poke the bear. I completely supported NATO putting these battalions up into, not big, multinational, but it's skin in the game in the Baltics. But when a Russian think tanker hands me this picture when I visit a year ago, and I love these guys. I'm an ex-American Army officer. They're out there showing the flag. That's in Estonia, Narva. That's not an Estonian fortress. There's a river, and that's Vangorod. That's Russian. And there are guys, an infantry company platoon, with a flag just with that draped over it, and that went viral. And then this is in Georgia 2 years ago. That is not a Georgian tank. That is a U.S. M1, and I'm okay with them training and coming over, but some enterprising young soldier, officer, young lieutenant or sergeant with a Georgian slaps a Georgian flag on top of the M1. And where do you think pictures of that ended up? Played into the threat. So here's kind of the Russian threat view, and you saw it react in Ukraine. And they see this as part of their buffer, part of their historical place, and they went to war over Ukraine, basically. Ukraine remains in stasis. It's bloody. I call it Northern Ireland in steroids. But they completely miscalculated how tough the Ukrainians would be. That's a good view, I think, of the Russian bear looking at the threat. All right, we've dealt with these invaders before from the West. And then here comes NATO. We're going to have to deal with them again. Okay? I think it's kind of, here we go again. Because here at that conference that I talked to you about, whether it is a couple of airplanes or a platoon or a company or battalion, there are big arrows on the Russian map, especially in the missile defense realm. And then here's a map to 200 internationals, including myself, co-worked with the Chinese, by the way. Here is the global U.S. Western threat to our interests. Russian Far East, I'm very interested in it. We don't have a lot of time. I think this is going to be a crucible of major challenges, not just for us, but the Russians. Right now it's working out, but they're not traditional friends, allies. This was in an unpopular annexation annexed from the Qing dynasty in the 1800s. Border conflicts, if you remember, in 1969, they put that all to bed. The Amur-Yasuri River remains a complicated place, but right now it's calm, they're trading, both have bigger fish to fry. Is this a strategic partnership or a relationship of convenience? We pivoted, and Russia pivoted as well, okay? They're not traditional friends, but they've got both other issues. We need to be very careful in our foreign policy how we manage the two. We don't want to drive them together. All right, this is a Russian and China common themes. Again, here is a Chinese general, 2-star, from their main operations directorate, and there's a Russian over there, and they're in Moscow showing this slide. Basically, it's the real intention about the Americans and their allies. Stage for global missile defense of the U.S. consolidated missile defense war against China and Russia. All right? And that is on a Russian stage to an international. North Korea, we don't know where this is going to head. Problem for China, but it is now a different equation when it was just purely China working the collapse issue, worrying about the arms in the area, and us being in the south, Resurgent. It's much more complicated now. Russians have some interests in Korea as well. They do have a lot of labor up there. It's also on their border. But here is the missile defense aspect. They are absolutely, and you're all in this world in one way or the other. This is unambiguous that we want to put in THAAD, the air defense system we are going to, and they're both against it, viscerally. And it's unambiguous, the North Korean threat. And I remember, here's the line. I'm an polite argument with a Russian senior think tanker, 2-star, used to be on me. We argue back and forth, and then he said, Piotr, it's the principle. Nothing to do with this. It's the principle of missile defense. Don't know where this is headed. Okay, they're talking about another meeting soon. Bottom line, you got to talk to tyrants. You can leave the tyrants alone, the area is, at least in the near term, is safer than it is now. Don't know where this is going to go. Here's China. You pay attention to the Belt and Road Initiative. Don't know where it's going to end. The Russians are on board guardedly, in my mind, because they don't have a choice. Okay, and so they're, I would say, if I'm a Russian strategist, trying to shape shape it, manage it, but I can't be too, and I'm investing in it too, but I can't be too comfortable with Chinese economic and influential, if you will, almost tentacles going through my former Soviet South. And also the Polar Silk Road. All right, they have declared an interest in the Polar Silk Road, and we'll have to see. The whole Arctic is critical. I was out just last December in China in a group think tank, and this is important for you. Besides the South China Sea and talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese, ladies and gentlemen, are also interested in intermediate nuclear forces, INF. They're interested in arms control for all the reasons you would understand. So we don't know where this relationship is going to go. I'm going to blaze through because I only have a few minutes. Russia and the high north, I think it's important. 50% of the boundary of the Arctic is Russian. They're part of the Arctic 8. I would say the Russians are aggressively status quo in there, meaning they want their way, they want to consolidate, they want to protect. I don't believe they have an ambition to conquer the pole. We are nervous neighbors, but actually a lot of cooperation there. The northern sea route would come up through here. How many of you saw Ice Station Zebra? Go see it if you haven't. It's a great Cold War movie, and it gets all into the Arctic. It's kind of cool. But the Russians made a claim. They they went underwater, submersible, in 2007 planted a flag, underwater flag, in the Lomonosov Ridge. It's resource rich. And Russia needs resources in the future. It's okay now. But that permafrost and all that. But guess what? A lot of other countries need resources, especially China and India. And we're talking generationally. And there are more and more claims that are being staked. They're the Arctic 8. Russia is part of that, so are we. And while there are lots of itchiness, all are careful about the militarization, though the Russians are doing stuff up there. Just a great cartoon. It's a free-for-all right now up there. And the Arctic 8, including us and the Russians, mostly Scandinavian, are trying to keep the law of the sea and all of that working up there. But we had to pull out with ExxonMobil, and the Chinese have filled a void up in one of the great big projects up here. Again, I think in the existential realm, China needs resources in the next generation to feed this machine, this gigantic entity, this rising hegemon that it is. We have our Northwest Passage. In the summers, now you have the Northern Sea Route. This is strategic. Now, remember, we talked about existential threats. Think about this being an opportunity for Russia financially, perhaps, though it's hard. But it's also another vulnerability. It's another big flank. But the icebreaker gap, they're serious about it. They're building new icebreakers. That's a new Sibir, biggest in the world. We have 2. We want to get 6 more, but we can't get the budget line for them. China's built 2, and then Finland and Sweden have more. Putin, the Russians are paying attention to the Arctic. Those of you that study this, they've created a new military district, the Northern Military District, especially to focus in the issues up there. You've read about the militarization. Now, a lot of them are old Soviet bases. A lot of them are also search and rescue places. I would be careful about over-exaggerating it. But clearly, they have put more military up there. And they have Arctic troops. And this was right through a parade in practice I saw in Moscow. They're beginning now to show off their Arctic vehicles. Kuril Islands are important. The Russians should have given them long ago, but the Sea of Okhotsk is a boomer bastion, SSBNs. So this is going to take some time. Remember KAL 007, okay, that flew through this sensitive area in 1983 and was shot down. This is a sensitive area. It's all part of the A2AD anti-access area denial that you hear, these integrated air defense systems. Which in my mind is a defensive perspective, actually a porcupine. So I believe while there's a lot of Russian stuff going on, what may look offensive, in my mind is preemptively reactive within this big defensive psychological umbrella for the reasons I've hoped in these short minutes to try to lay out. Here is a assessment of what their anti-ship missile, cruise missile laydown could look like. Again, it's more defensive. However, in your world, they still play the nuclear triad really quickly. And the North, the Arctic, is fundamental to it, both in the East and the West. And they've got their triad too. All right, you've got the Barents. This is where the Kursk went down. You've got, I think, at least unclassified, you've got 7 boomers up there. They've got a new class of them going on, Dmitry Donskoy. And so, I mean, you've got that. And then you've got their bastion out here that are also very, very heavily protected. All right, they've got now a major command center, an integrated command center. It was opened in 2015 that manages now these strategic, if you will, almost Eurasian perspective. This is a think tanker, former officer's dream. I'm in Moscow last year, and they're doing parade practice. How many times you get to see an SS-24 drive by with a range of 7,000 miles? You know, and that's a selfie. So here in your world is, where is this going? Because this is really important, I would submit. I mean, it's critical, and it's shredding. And how we get there is going to be really important. Are we in new Cold War? I don't know. I think since we killed, since the death of the hundreds of contractors, we're in a different space. It's very, very, very delicate. We are most vulnerable back into your world for an accident and incident that in this cyber-fast world could get out of control. And if crisis arrives to Moscow or Washington, and it doesn't have to be in Syria, it could be out there in the Sea of O in the Arctic or somewhere else, it may be too late. So we got to be really, really careful here. Who's next? Don't know. He's in till 2024. Who follows? Will he stay? What's next? Again, Russia's opaque. We couldn't imagine a guy like Putin in 1999 after Yeltsin coming to power. Everything's going according to plan. The Russians have a narrative. Все идет по плану. And they're doing an incredible, in my mind, shell game of managing a lot of stuff with that population. Oh, by the way, their military is under 1 million active duty. Now, they got a lot of other forces and enablers, but they're not that big. I love Putin. You know, I mean, he's got a lot of youth support. And this is kind of, I like the slide because they're dealing, there is a portrayal of strength, and they are strong in many ways. But it is an incredible balancing game right now when you're looking at vulnerable borders, demography, sanctions, economy, migration, terror, health, dissent, history, distrust, lack of allies, climate, commitments, and this demographic and, if you will, geographical time. When in all doubt, they've got that. All right, and that keeps them on equal. They believe that we don't see them fairly. We don't respect them, and they want that. They want, in their mind, a fair shake. They were down in the depths in the 1990s. It was everybody's mistake, but it was just a lost opportunity. But this is what keeps them an equalizer. As we are, they're modernizing because they feel they have to. Okay, all right. I will stop and open up to questions.